All right. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the College of St. Scholastica, and once again to the 2023-24 series of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice. My name is Tim Lorick. I'm the director of this series. I'm also an assistant professor here at the college. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all of our students in the audience tonight. We hope to see you at future events. Please keep coming. If you have questions, suggestions, or would like to get involved, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And that goes for anyone in the general public as well. So our public lecture series this year is called Water, Sustaining Life in the 21st Century. You know, this series is now over 30 years old, and throughout these 3 decades, it's been made possible by the generous donation and vision of the Alworth family. So thank you very much to Karen and Royal Alworth, who are here with us tonight once again. This series is also possible thanks to funding from the Warner Manitou Fund, the Eddy Foundation, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Ivre Foundation, and the Mary C. Van Ivre Foundation Endowed Fund in memory of William Van Ivre. Additional support comes from the Royal D. Alworth Jr. Institute at the University of Minnesota Duluth, the UMD Department of World Languages and Cultures, the Duluth Reader, the Western Lake Superior Sanitary District, Duluth Sister Cities International, the League of Women Voters of Duluth, and other private donors. Thank you very much. For more information about this year's series, or for links to previous speakers, including our first speaker in this series on water, you can go to css.edu/peace. We also have a YouTube page with recordings from all of our previous speakers. So now, without further ado, I'm really thrilled to introduce Dr. Nancy Langston, Distinguished Professor of Environmental History at Michigan Technological University. In 2020, jumping the gun a little bit there. In 2021, Dr. Langston was awarded the Distinguished Scholar Award from the American Society for Environmental History and is author of 5 books on climate history, Great Lakes history, forest and wetland history, and toxics history. Dr. Langston's most recent book is Climate Ghosts, Migratory Species in the Anthropocene, based on the 2019 Mandel Lectures in the Humanities at Brandeis University. And fun fact, I was there, and I worked at Brandeis University at that time. Dr. Langston visited my class just like she did today. So we've come full circle here in Duluth. Dr. Langston's previous books before Climate Ghosts include Sustaining Lake Superior, An Extraordinary Lake in a Changing World, another book, A History of Endocrine Disruptors, titled Toxic Bodies, Hormone Disruptors, and the Legacy of DES, an environmental history of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, titled Where Land and Water Meet, A Western Landscape Transformed, and a history of old-growth crisis in the West, titled Forest Dreams, Forest Nightmares, The Paradox of Old Growth in the Inland West. Since July 2013, Dr. Langston has been a professor at Michigan Tech, part of the Great Lakes Research Center and the Department of Social Sciences. Before that, she was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for 17 years with appointments in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology. Dr. Langston is also an accomplished public essayist, artist, and digital humanities scholar with a ton of cool stuff on her website, nancylangston.net. Nancy Langston.
Thank you, all of you, for coming. The lights are bright, so I can't actually see any of you, but I'll pretend and gaze into your eyes, even though I can't see it. So it's a great honor to be here tonight. I think back in 1996, soon after I moved to the Midwest from Seattle, I made my first trip to Lake Superior. And Madison's a wonderful city, but it's kind of flat, and there are all these trees in the way. And you can't really see a lot of water that's not green because the lakes are covered with algal blooms. And I came to Lake Superior for the first time, 96, and thought, oh, I've come home. I can stay here in the Midwest. And I fell in love with Lake Superior at that point. and I've been working on Lake Superior questions for about 15 years. And as I think many of you know, Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. I have a lot of friends who work on Lake Baikal, and they always say, we have more volume, but we have more surface area. What many of you may not know is we're also the fastest warming large lake in the world. Lake Superior has 11% of the world's fresh surface water. It's a lot of water. 21%, we are at the head of the Great Lakes Basin with more than 20% of it, just about 21% of the world's fresh surface water. So with all the changes that are happening from climate change, from other kinds of environmental disruption, clean water is our most precious resource. So I came up to Duluth from Michigan Tech, from the Keweenaw a couple days ago, to be part of an EPA workshop asking the question of how do we deal with the increasing pressures on the Great Lakes, in particular Lake Superior. We have a big mining boom going on right now because we have many essential minerals, critical minerals, that are needed for the transition to clean energy, because you need to store much of that energy for when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. And so we need to figure out how best to help supply North America and the world with the ability to store energy from renewables without threatening what we love about the lake and all our entangled kin, all the other creatures that make up this Great Lake Basin. So several years ago, I wrote a book, or started working on a book called Climate Ghosts. And it's about 3 different species in the upper Great Lakes Basin that especially make their home here in the Lake Superior Basin that are dependent on water and that are what I call climate ghosts, because there's still individuals in these populations. Some of the populations seem quite big, but they are increasingly threatened from environmental change. And so I'll make the argument tonight that it's not too late to save these species, but it will take determined work on the part of all the communities around the Great Lakes, especially in the Lake Superior Basin, to adapt to the changes that are happening now and to make sure we have a resilient, vibrant future for all the creatures that make the Great Lakes their home. So the first species I'm going to talk about tonight briefly is lake sturgeon, which is a fish. And so people realize, okay, fish need water. But I'll also talk about woodland caribou, which a lot of people don't realize still make their home in the Great Lakes Basin and are dependent on healthy watersheds. And then I'll talk about common loons, which are a real icon for those of you who live here in Duluth and still have what seem like really healthy populations, but populations that are at risk of grave collapse if we don't act now to protect the waters that make up their homes. So first, sturgeon. Sturgeon are really big, really old fish. This is actually a beluga sturgeon from Europe, which can reach 4,400 pounds and live 300 years. That is incredible for a fish. It's the size of a whale, of a beluga whale. It's bigger than a narwhal. And these fish can live to such incredible ages that the lake sturgeon we have in the Great Lakes that have been restored in the Great Lakes today still potentially have memories, experience the incredible rush of European settlement. They're old enough to have lived through the changes we're still witnessing the effects of today. So they're great ways to study the legacies of history. So lake sturgeon were once one of the most abundant fish in the upper Great Lakes. And they went through dramatic changes from the Ice Age. As the ice retreated, as the ice expanded, they had to move down to what's now the southern Appalachians. As the ice retreated, they were able to move back up as the waters rushed forth. And so they became one of the most abundant fish. And many of the tribes here, particularly the Anishinaabe and the Dakota, made lake sturgeon the center of their lives. Just as, say, the Pacific Northwest tribes, salmon is both a really important material resource. It's what you eat, it's what you smoke to get you through the winter, but it also holds your spiritual worlds together. The same is true of lake sturgeon. But many of the settlers who came looked at sturgeon in very different ways. And so by 1885, there were still over 9 million lake sturgeon in the Great Lakes. And then not that much later, by the 1920s, they had collapsed, about 95% collapse, a really dramatic collapse. And that was for a number of reasons. Partly, European settlers didn't really like them. Some of the Portuguese liked them because they were used to smoking them. But at first, most of the commercial fishermen, the white commercial fishermen in the area, sturgeon would catch the nets and rip the nets, and there was not much of an economic market. So what people would actually, white settlers, white commercial fishers, would pull them up on shore, let them dry, and then they're so high in oil, they use them as fuel for the steamships. And so there'd be these big piles of basically logs, because the logs had gone underground to prop up the mine shafts, so they needed something to burn for the steamships. And so they burned rotten sturgeon. I mean, I can just imagine being on those boats smelling that. I mean, that's pretty intense. And so that was a pretty big hit on the population. And then some really entrepreneuring person realized that you could actually scoop the caviar out of the sturgeon and sell it to Russians as caviar, as beluga caviar, just a little mislabeling. And so all of a sudden there was a big economic use for the sturgeon. And so say along Lake Erie, there were all sorts of villages that sprung up to take advantage of this new economic resource. But that didn't last very long. The decline of the lake sturgeon happened really quickly between scooping out their caviar, killing the adult females. They take such a long time to get old enough to breed that when you really focus on killing adult females for their caviar, for their eggs, basically, you can just decimate the population. And so as the lake sturgeon crashed, many of the tribal peoples in this area were profoundly affected, not just economically, not just for food, but also spiritually, because they were really key kin. The Anishinaabe in particular, but also the Dakota, saw and continue to see them as relatives that you can use as resources, but you have to use in a respectful manner. So watching so many of these sturgeon just be slaughtered and laid on the banks to rot was a real fracture in the heart. It really devastated many of the native peoples. But then with the Endangered Species Act, there was a new value placed by lots of different communities on trying to restore populations of fish, of birds, of mammals, of amphibians that had not yet gone extinct. And lake sturgeon became a major target of restoration. And so initially, the scientists, the wildlife biologists with Fish and Wildlife weren't having a lot of luck with sturgeon restoration, in part because they treated them all as one big population, that you could just pick one up and move it somewhere else and everything would be fine. And at that point, tribal biologists from the Menominee Nation, from different Anishinaabe nations, from the Dakota, came and said, look, we want to be part of this restoration, but we want you to do it in a way that uses what's called two-eyed seeing, that blends indigenous traditions and stories with the very best of modern science and pulls them together rather than separating. And so one of the really hopeful projects that happened with the Menominee Nation was what was called Welcoming Home Neme. So Neme is a word for grandfather used across many, many tribal nations in the upper Great Lakes. And so there are all sorts of really dramatic books that have been written about it, People of the Sturgeon, when tribal biologists, tribal members began to go out and be the water keepers and the water warriors and stand by the banks where the last of the adult individuals were spawning, were moving on their spawning migrations. Because sturgeon are migratory fish. They're so big that they have to go out to the big open lakes to get enough energy to get so big, and then they swim back upstream to the tiny little tributaries to spawn. But unlike salmon, they don't die then. Then they can float back down and get big and gather a lot of energy and swim back up. So it's on those migrations that they're really vulnerable. And so the biologists and the community members, elders in particular, from the tribes came together with white anglers and Fish for Tomorrow and said, hey, we want to really work on restoring these fish, but in a really culturally appropriate, sensitive way. And so one of the first things the tribe wanted to do was what's called assisted migration. Because on many of the reservations now, there are dams that were put forth, mostly for hydropower, but also for some other reasons. And they block migration. And so fish, some fish can go upstream around dams, so there was some fish passage. But one of the dams on the Menominee Reservation is just way too high for fish to jump over, and way too high to have little avenues for fish to swim around it. And so what the tribe said is what we want to do is to take some of the eldest fish that we are sure still have memories of living on the reservation, living on the Wolf River, on the Menominee River, up above these big dams. And we want to catch them and carry them around the dam to let them re-inhabit these ancestral waters. And at first, some of the recreational fishing groups, which were mostly whites, said, we don't want to do this. It might hurt the population. That sounds really risky. We want the balance of nature. Let's just let the fish come back on their own. And the tribal biologists said, balance of nature is kind of a nice idea, but there's really no such thing, we know. Nature has to work with people. We've been affecting nature for millennia, ever since people first came to this area. Why don't, instead of just insisting, let fish find their own way back, why don't we use the science and the technology we have today? And so the state of Wisconsin agreed to try this, and Minnesota did some similar projects. And so they essentially use these incredible new technologies called making the invisible visible. So they put these individual transmitters inside the bodies of the fish so they could track exactly where these fish were coming from. And they had these mobile nurseries, essentially. And so what they realized was that fish have what's called natophilopatry. Sorry, I should have given you that term before, but it means that they're really faithful to their homes. And so they like to go back to where they spawn, and then they'll migrate back out to the huge open lake to get fat again. And so what they did was they moved nurseries around. They could track these individuals and put them in the special places where they could recognize that water by the smell of the water. Actually, scientists don't even know exactly how they recognize it, but they know these fish have really close ties to home. And so with these transmitters, with special mobile laboratories, and with a great deal of prayer and ceremony and kinship rituals, they actually were able to restore lake sturgeon. And this has happened throughout the Great Lakes Basin. There's been extraordinary work down along Lake Superior, down along Lake Michigan with different tribes, and there's a really wonderful story map made by a person, Brandon Kunuk at NOAA, called I Will See You, which looks at how, by pulling together what's called two-eyed seeing, tribal knowledge, indigenous knowledge, scientific knowledge, and real respect for the fish as individuals as well as populations, you can begin to restore these populations. So Fish and Wildlife Service and the tribes are doing all sorts of experiments with taking down smaller dams, restoring the culverts, because some of the culverts are what's called perched. It's really high for the fish to swim back upstream. And the restoration of lake sturgeon has become a biological success, but also a real success in terms of cultural healing and coming together as different peoples. So that's a really hopeful story. And another climate ghost in this region is another species called woodland caribou. And in 2019, after I published Sustaining Lake Superior, I got a call from Leah Lapagno, who's resource manager for the Michipicoten First Nations community, which is on the north shore of Lake Superior, another Anishinaabe community. And he said, hey, Nance, I read your Sustaining Lake Superior, but you didn't talk about caribou. And I said, nope, what caribou? And what I hadn't realized is this area was home to one of the world's great caribou populations. I thought we just had like Caribou Coffee and Caribou Street, but all those were named after woodland caribou, which not that long ago stretched all the way from Newfoundland and Labrador, all the way from the Atlantic Ocean out to the Big Bog, all the way out to western Minnesota, all the way north to Hudson's Bay and James Bay, all the way south, almost down to what's now Detroit and Minneapolis. Long before there were moose here or white-tailed deer, there were woodland caribou. They were the deer species that helped shape the northern forests. And it was through caribou that people could come to this area after the retreat of the glaciers. And so the tribes who came, the ancestors of the Anishinaabe, came because of their relations with caribou. And that's partly because as the glaciers retreated, it was dry and cold and windy, and there were lichen and there were some grasses, but there were not a lot of the foods that people typically eat. But what people could eat was caribou. And so we followed the caribou, we tracked the caribou north. And Pierre Vitebsky, one of the great anthropologists who works in the Arctic, argues that all across the north, it was caribou and reindeer, which are the same species, that made human life and culture possible, helped us survive the Ice Age, helped us, survive through hunting, helped us create art and culture and language. And the stories the tribes tell about this area indicate that even though tribes here did not domesticate caribou into reindeer, they still shared a heart, or what the stories say, that caribou would rescue humans during famine for humans, and in turn, humans would rescue their caribou and reindeer kin when the caribou were suffering. And so archaeologists right now from the tribes and from University of Michigan are finding these extraordinary hunting structures at the bottom of Lake Huron, which is where the caribou once migrated into this region, and the people followed them and helped guide their migrations and protect them from predators. And so Leo called me and said, hey, did you know that our caribou herd on Lake Superior is about to be extirpated? It's about to go extinct. And I said, what caribou? I didn't know there were still caribou here. I thought they vanished hundreds of years ago. And it turned out on the north shore of Canada, there was still a herd of caribou. And here are some of the individuals from that herd on Michipicoten Island. So this was the core once of a population that stretched all the way up to James Bay and Hudson's Bay. But in a whole host of actions, that population had dropped to just 22 individuals by 2019. And the First Nations community wanted to use helicopters to rescue them. Essentially, the caribou co-evolved with wolves and bears, their major predators, but caribou are really well adapted to running in deep snow. They can run across ice, they can run to islands, and so they nested on islands. I work on birds too. They didn't nest, they bred on these islands. This is in Pukasaw National Park right here on the north shore of Lake Superior. So those little offshore islands, they could run across the ice, and then they could run from island to island to protect their calves and breed safely. And then they could move further inland during the non-breeding season. But with all the changes that have happened in the past century, wolves have been able to move much more into caribou refugia. And so one of the things that had happened was across North America, the last of the US woodland caribou went extinct in 2018, just before Leo called me. The herd was down to just 3 individuals, all female, so they couldn't breed. That was in the Selkirk Mountains of Idaho. And in Lake Superior, you can see this green is where the population fragment remain. Let's see if I can push the button. Whoops, I'm pushing a button, but not the button. Okay, yeah. So there was what's called the discontinuous distribution. So there was a big gap right here, which is where the Ring of Fire mining and railway development had happened. So there were some populations here where there's still islands and wetlands, and then populations all the way up by Hudson's Bay, but a big gap in between. And just a few individuals left in this population. And they had gotten trapped on an island, Michipicoten Island. They had made their way when there was an ice bridge, and wolves came as well. So there were 2,000 caribou on the island and 2 wolves. And then the ice went away, and soon there were 20 wolves and only 20 caribou left. And so the First Nations community said, we want to move them to some wolf-free islands. Either we want to move the wolves off the island to Isle Royale, which was looking for wolves, but all the politics of moving Canadian wolves to the US were going to take too long, so that wasn't an option. So they said, well, why don't we just move some of the caribou to some of these that's hard to say 5 times, wolf-free islands. And at first the Ontario ministry, there were going to be some move to what's known as Caribou Island, because when Alexander Henry, one of the first European explorers, came, he noted that there were all sorts of caribou on what's now known as Caribou Island. And so here were 3 of the caribou biologists, and they were really interested in moving the caribou. But the Ontario ministry said, but that would violate the balance of nature. Wolves and caribou just have to work it out. And that's what our indigenous history tells us. And the indigenous tribes themselves said, what are you talking about? We have modern helicopters, we have modern science. We know they're going to be extirpated or go extinct. And if that population go extinct, then we lose all that habitat in between. And what that means is what's known as the discontinuous distribution here. Let's see. Okay. So this is potential caribou habitat, and there's a chance that caribou can restore their migrations, their migratory species. And so as long as that's potential habitat, Ontario can only develop up to 30% of it for mining and electric transmission. But the instant those last caribou vanish in this green area in the parks area and protected wetlands, then all of a sudden all that boreal forest can be opened up for development. So the tribe said, the First Nation said, we think that you're using this balance of nature ideology as a way to just let the caribou go extinct. Why don't we use our technology? We know how to protect them, at least in the short term. And so this, the gentleman on the left, Gord Easton, was a retired ministry biologist who had actually, since the 1970s, had been moving caribou to protected islands to try and expand their population. Leo is the gentleman in the middle, and Christian Schroeder is a computer scientist who's also really good at media. So the ministry said, no, we'll just let the balance of nature work itself out. And so Christian and Leo and Gord started talking to the media. And so eventually the Canadian ministry said, okay, fine, you find some helicopters, we can try. This is actually a New York Times article. The only way to save these caribou was up. And so the caribou were moved to Caribou Island and also to the Slate Islands. And there the population is persisting. The hope is that these caribou can become a healthy enough population so they can move to the mainland again and then begin to reconnect up with the main population, restore their migrations. And so what was kind of surprising was that this was so controversial to me. And I was really surprised that this old idea of the balance of nature was this idea that humans and the rest of nature have to be separate, we have to restore things by just leaving them alone, was still so powerful because the reasons for the declines were because of a lot of human disturbance and interference, but the logical jump that therefore you just step back and let them find their own way through a changing world seemed like an odd logic. So what I wanted to do was work with the tribes and First Nations to try and understand some of the reasons why caribou had declined, because caribou, like sturgeon, had really been the target of a lot of restoration. It turned out Teddy Roosevelt, back at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th, was convinced that we needed to act as soon as possible to save caribou. And yet, for over a century, folks have been trying to save them, but their population was still crashing. So I was really interested in, can we learn anything from those experiences to help us devise better restoration programs that work for the future? What do we need to know about this balance of nature, about how much can we interfere with caribou and still have them be wild? And so I started looking at some of the reasons for declines. And this was what's called the guide. And one of the things I realized was that caribou moved away as soon as infrastructure came in. I have a grad student, Jordan Peterson, who's now with the Maine Department of Fish and Wildlife, where they're working on trying to restore caribou there. And he did a wonderful GIS project here that looked at which herds had persisted in the upper Great Lakes Basin and which had declined, and tried to figure out with historical layers, what were the associations with that? Was it mines? Was it railroad? Was it forestry? Was it loss of wetlands? And what he realized was that it was really infrastructure from railroads and mining, and not so much because they directly hurt the caribou, but because initially they brought in a lot of hunters, a lot of recreational hunters. So when logging camps came in, when mining camps came in, the people wanted fresh meat. And remember, we didn't really have white-tailed deer there. They thought caribou were so abundant, you could hunt as many as you wanted. But caribou were difficult to hunt because they are really wetland dependent as well as deep snow. So they would go into the wetlands for protection. And so what the white hunters soon realized was that they needed what they called a native guide. This is one of the gentlemen that they hired. And yet when the caribou began to decline, rather than say maybe our hunting or our mining isn't quite working with caribou, they blamed it on the indigenous hunters themselves and started restricting tribal hunting, which had been so necessary for survival. So by 1850, caribou were gone from Wisconsin. Remember, they had stretched down to what's almost Madison now. So that was really quite early. That was during the era of really intensified logging. And then by 1912, they were gone from Michigan, except for what's now Isle Royale. They were gone from Isle Royale by 1928, and Isle Royale was actually a caribou lynx ecosystem rather than a wolf-moose ecosystem. Moose only came after the caribou were hunted out. And yet they persisted in Minnesota. They persisted on the North Shore near what's now Tofta and near Hovland and into the boundary waters. And they particularly persisted in what's known as the Big Bog. And that was where the healthiest population remained until the late 1930s. And that's the red area right there. And so in the 1930s, one of the world's first restoration programs for caribou began. And that was when the state of Minnesota partnered with what's now the Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal soil agency as well, and said, our caribou are beginning to vanish, and so we really need to protect them. And the first thing the biologist said was, these are migratory species. Like sturgeon, they need to move. And caribou had migrated from what's now these huge bogs all the way up across what's now the boundary between Canada up into the Rainy Lake and Lake of the Woods watersheds. But those migration corridors had been cut apart by dams and by the hardening of the border between the two countries. And so caribou persisted in the Big Bog area, the Red Lake area, well into the 1930s, but their migrations had become much shorter. And the Red Lake Nation, which is still retains much of or a small fraction of their ancestral lands, had managed them along with lake sturgeon for what they say as time immemorial, for millennia, living with caribou. And this is a picture of Big Bog of the boardwalk that goes out. And as you walk across that boardwalk, you can still see the paths of caribou that they made over millennia, going back and forth on their migrations. And so the federal biologists and the state biologists said, let's do whatever we can to hold on to this last population. And those biologists knew immediately that migration was core, but they thought, well, we can't really let them migrate because Canada's up there. And they also were so afraid of the tribal members from the Red Lake Reservation. They were so afraid that the tribal members might shoot them, might poach them, because they had this vision in their head, the white biologists, that it was indigenous hunting and wolves that decimated caribou. And so the biologists initially dug some wallows in the bog. They sort of dug some holes because caribou like to stay cool in the summer. And they did a number of other projects, and it just didn't stop the decline of the caribou. So they said, okay, let's go to Canada and bring some caribou down from Manitoba. So they got permission. They hired a number of indigenous community members and trappers from up in Canada to help them. It's actually really hard to trap caribou, it turns out. And then they brought them down on trucks and trains and released them in the bog. And yet at the same time, they were so terrified that tribal members would poach them that they decided to build a fence around the caribou. Even though the biology just said it's the lack of migration that is killing caribou, they were also terrified that the tribal members. And part of the reason they were terrified of that was that the Red Lake Nation had had well more than 25 million acres. And when they were ordered off, when other Minnesota tribes were ordered to leave their ancestral lands and go to what's now the White Lake Reservation, the Red Lake Nation absolutely refused to do that. And they kept winning court cases over and over and over again until finally in 1909, the Volstead Act essentially took away most of their tribal lands except for a tiny little area around Red Lake. And it said we have to develop these wetlands because, untouched wetlands are pointless. They didn't realize that tribal members have been using these wetlands since time immemorial. They weren't untouched. They were very, very much altered by people, but they hadn't been drained for farming. They were used for berry picking, for sturgeon, for caribou hunting. And yet, to the Wisconsin legislature, all they saw was wasted land. They thought, we can bring in farmers to farm it. And so they took the funds from the tribe that the tribe had been using to work on their fish hatchery and try and restore sturgeon. They basically took those funds and said, we're going to use those for drainage. And the tribe absolutely was furious, took them to court over and over again, and lost because in the eyes of the Minnesota legislature, drainage was a higher use of the wetlands. And so this is the 1908 Volstead Act. And so by the time Fish and Wildlife Service came in the 1930s, you've heard this story before. These efforts to drain the bog just didn't work. It worked for a tiny bit, but then fires swept through. The peat began to collapse. Some of the peat began to burn. This was an incredibly, incredibly difficult place to try and farm. Many of the farmers who came here from other parts of Minnesota, who'd been promised a wonderful life, lost everything they had. It was really a tragedy all along. And so when finally people realized, when whites realized this Volstead Act was not working, the big bog was really essential as a part of the ecosystem, rather than return the land to the tribes, it became part of what is now the state wildlife and wetlands area. And so that was when the Caribou Restoration Project began. And so here are some pictures from that restoration effort. And it's wonderful reading these biologists. They were really, really devoted biologists. And yet what they didn't realize was their core assumptions that it was indigenous peoples who destroyed wildlife, that was racist at its core. So they just couldn't see that some of their decisions were in effect dooming the caribou. And so those few caribou soon dwindled away. Soon there were 3 lone individuals. This time it was males, no females to breed. And eventually those caribou just vanished. And that was one of the main extirpations of caribou. And yet the Big Bog area is still one of the most extraordinary wetlands in the lower 48 states and still has enormous potential as a restoration area for caribou. And the Red Lake Nation is now really interested in working with Fish and Wildlife Service to try and reverse those decades of harm, to take out some of the ditches that had drained the pattern peatlands and try and restore migration corridors back to the habitat. But after World War II, development in the boreal north, especially in Canada, really accelerated. And so those big dams had been built during the war to supply energy, to supply hydropower for fighting during the war, to produce more and more paper, to produce steel. And with that impetus after the war, the industrial use of the logs of the boreal forest really intensified as well. And mining also intensified in Canada. And so these losses of caribou continued, this time on the Canadian side. So this red is now showing in southern Ontario. But hopefully you can see, let's see if this works. Is that working? So here along from about Thunder Bay over through Puckasaw National Park over to Lake Superior Provincial Park. That's not red. There were still caribou there that could still continue their migration. And those are the herds that folks are trying to understand, how can we restore them? This GIS series of maps, which was not done by me, it's done by a different environmental group, shows some of the disturbance from mining and from logging in the southern boreal forest that has happened since World War II. So it has been very intensively developed. And what we find is where caribou herds persisted are where there are wetlands. More wetlands and more protected areas really, really help protect caribou. More railroads and more mines, that's where caribou are extirpated. And so right now, the Ontario Ministry and the Canadian government is faced with a choice. Can we help woodland caribou persist in this warming world? And you hear all sorts of times folks say we have such intense climate change, which of course we do. Caribou are doomed. And so why bother to save them? In fact, one of the Ontario Ministry biologists actually said to me, we have to do triage. We have to focus on what we can save. Caribou are going to die in a warming world. But environmental history tells us something slightly different, actually. I don't know if any of you remember your studies of the post-Pleistocene, the megafauna mostly bit the dust, the saber-toothed tigers, the dire wolves. They aren't roaming around with us. What survived were caribou and reindeer, and also musk oxen. They are incredibly resilient, and that's partly because they partnered with people. They formed these close relationships, an incredible diversity. I've worked in Mongolia with reindeer herders that fully domesticate, but still the reindeer have agency. Reindeer caribou are the same species. They get to decide where to go in the mountains near Lake Baikal. In what's now Sapmi, in Finland, in Sweden, in the Kola Peninsula, where reindeer still thrive because of partnerships with people that help protect them on their migrations, and in return, the reindeer offer people all sorts of things. And so one of the things we know is that caribou can thrive in a warming world if they can move. Unlike moose that start to pant, have a really hard time feeding once it's above 20 Celsius or about 78 degrees, caribou can actually continue to forage until it's 95 degrees, which is kind of, I can't eat it that hot. They can be really resilient to increased temperature just so they have a chance to migrate, to move. And yet we have this interesting situation where we've done such a good job at restoring wolf habitat and also white-tailed deer that those two species can make it really hard for caribou unless you protect them on their migrations and during their calving from wolves and protect them from the brain worm that deer transmit. And so our task now is to figure out ways to restore those migrations. There's still plenty of northern habitat for caribou to migrate, but to figure out how to help them move without turning them into fully domesticated animals. So part of my work right now is I just got back from 6 weeks in Iceland, where I work on the reindeer that were translocated, moved there in the 1770s. They've been moved 30 different projects all throughout the world, mostly by the Norwegians, as part of their kind of global efforts at whaling and settlement. And why we don't probably want to have global whaling anymore, we can learn a lot from these historic projects that actually did restore and are translocate and help caribou and reindeer migrate around the world. So migration is really core to resilience and persistence. But what's also really core is what indigenous communities have been telling us for a long time, which is seeing caribou, like sturgeon, as kin, as our relatives. You can still hunt them, you can still move them around, but you can't just see them as widgets, as factory machines. You have to respect them, see them as individuals, and respect their independence as you help them survive in a warming world. So one of the interesting things is scientists are starting to realize, it's probably too small to read there, but that caribou are probably going to be really essential partners in a warming Arctic. And it's because areas with more caribou have much lower rates of warming, because caribou grazing, just like muskoxen grazing, actually helps keep shrubification of the north happening. Shrubification is what happens when you have more and more shrubs grow up in a warming boreal forest, in a warming Arctic, and that absorbs a lot of heat. But when you have caribou and muskoxen, they actually eat the shrubs, they encourage the grasses, and that, just like big glaciers, reflects the heat back up into the atmosphere before it's absorbed. So there's a lot of work going on to actually look at how do we help caribou and muskoxen as well thrive across the Arctic to help us deal with climate change. And finally, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about loons, because I think loons are probably a lot more familiar to all of us, or to many of us, than caribou and sturgeon, unless, of course, you're an angler. Isn't this a wonderful photograph by a Smithsonian, by a National Geographic photographer? Loons we think of as, as birds that like lakes, but loons are really water birds. They're pretty awkward on land. I don't know if any of you have ever sort of watched a loon try, and they're really goofy looking because of the way their bellies are so big. But in the water, they're just extraordinary. So let's see if I can make I'm actually not sure how to get those sounds working with this. Whoops. Oh, well. Let's see. That's too bad. Well, you'll just have to, anybody want to do a yodel of a loon for me? Afterwards, maybe after the questions, I can figure out how to make those sounds work, given that it's not my laptop right here. If the person controlling the computer can move the mouse, that would work. But this image right here, which unfortunately I'm probably not going to be able to make it work, shows a loon swimming underwater and underwater diving, and you get a sense, they're almost like penguins. They're just the most extraordinarily graceful birds, amazing in the water. Oh, thank you, whoever did that. Who did that? That's awesome. Anyway, here they go. There's the diver. Loon is very curious about that red diving ball. So, one of a story across the Arctic, across the north, that's common to many, many Arctic cultures, indigenous cultures, tells of the loon. Now, has anyone ever seen a loon's eye, the males, turn red during the breeding season? And those bright red eyes became symbol for many, many northern peoples of the loon as a shaman, as a guide into the other world. Loons are most active at dawn and dusk. Their calls are really haunting and are really powerful right as light turns to dark, and then their bright eyes. So for many, many peoples, loons are seen as emissaries between death and life. And that really frightens a lot of people, but other people welcome that. So one story that's common across the north is about a young boy who was a great hunter, and his mother got very jealous of that. The father had long ago left. And so the mother actually blinded the young man because she was jealous that he was such a good hunter. And so he's sitting there by the side of the lake crying because he can no longer hunt for his family, and also because his mother was clearly very mean to him. So he's crying, and up swims a loon And the loon asks him, what's the matter? And so he tells her, and so she says, climb onto my back. And so he climbs onto her back, and she says, hold on tight. And so she dives down very deeply, very, very deeply. Loons can dive 200 meters, stay underwater for more than 15 minutes. They're just extraordinary with their lungs. And so she then surfaces, and she tells the boy, keep your eyes closed. Now we're going to dive again. So she says, take a deep breath, and then they dive even deeper, comes up a second time to the surface, and she says one more time, and she dives hundreds of meters deep, and then comes back up, and she says to the boy, open your eyes, and he can see again. And he says, oh my gosh, what can I give you? This is so extraordinary. You've restored the gift of vision, of seeing. And she says to him, all I ask of you is that you see the world around you, is that you keep the lake well stocked with fish, and that you value my people, my loon people, and protect us and the gifts of the lake as long as you live. And so he promises to do that, to be her partner, because she has saved him from his mother's vengeance. And so what's interesting is this story is common to so many northern cultures. But across many European cultures, loons were still seen as this sort of emissary between life and death, but they were seen with dread. And so in Icelandic cultures, in Nordic cultures, in Sweden, where I used to live, loons were seen just like wolves as almost demonic creatures because of their calls, and they were hunted down and often treated with real violence. And in early American conservation, the same thing was true, and that was because early American conservation, like here, William Murray, one of the great conservationists who protected the Adirondack lakes, saw loons in the same way many conservationists saw wolves. Animals were divided into good animals and bad animals, and loons were bad animals like wolves because they were predators. And so in this great book, Adventures in the Wilderness by William Murray, one of the great books that helped protect the Adirondacks, he has this endless chapter about hunting a loon to protect the fish and how hard it is and how wily they are. And Thoreau was one of the first European Americans to actually say, yes, loons are like wolves. They're wild, they're beyond our control, but that is something magical that we should listen to and help protect. And so well into the 20th century, loon hunting was legal and encouraged. As it went, more fish, more fun. And so throughout the Americas, white people would go and hunt loons, in part to increase the fish in the lakes. That became illegal with the Migratory Bird Treaty, even though it still happened. And then eventually protection came, and people began to love up north. They began to love going to lakes in the North Country and listening to the loons call. And in some ways, that loving them almost loved them to death, because Northwoods tourism really boomed with more money after World War II. And so as folks began to buy houses on the lake, they immediately made them look like their suburban houses. And you can see from this image, this is a Wisconsin picture holiday, that there's not a lot of riparian habitat. There's not a lot of good habitat right by the lake. It's been really turned into lawns. And loons need fairly intact lakes because they nest right along the lake shore. And when you clear out all that vegetation, it can really hurt them. And nest disturbances, this kind of water skiing became very popular, and recreational boating, and also that caused a lot of loon nest disturbance. And one of the interesting things that happened was, as people became more and more in love with up north tourism, they sort of realized they didn't like all those annoying things like bugs everywhere and algae. There were all these mosquitoes, and there was this cool chemical called DDT left over from the war. And so these are some images from Wisconsin, but the same was true in Michigan and in Minnesota. There were massive spraying projects by the wildlife agencies to get rid of the mosquitoes that were annoying anglers so much. But of course, they also form the basis of food webs for the fish that loons eat. And so this is DDT spraying by the DNR. Arsenic was also sprayed in astonishing quantities to control some of the algal blooms that were happening with all this increased development. And so that is literally exponential growth in the aquatic nuisances program that Wisconsin innovated. And so all these things hit loons really hard because they're fish-eating birds, which is why people were so freaked out about them for a while, and they depend on healthy watersheds to survive. And so people began, as they began to really love North, we see all this loon iconography. The loonie is one of the Canadians, the Canadian dollar. I love the loon toilet seats. There's a giant loon in Mercer, Wisconsin, that you can go see. And yet at the same time, in recent years, people have fallen in love with loons. They've sort of shifted from wilderness as a terrifying thing to wilderness we want to embrace. But we still haven't quite figured out how to really protect their habitat. So here we see, this is Audubon. So this is year 2000. And the yellow is summer range, the blue is winter range. And then by 2080, I'm not sure, it's a little hard to see, but Audubon projects that we will essentially have lost loon breeding in Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin if current trajectories remain. And there's still plenty of time to stop this, but it begins with respecting what the loon is telling us. One thing a lot of people don't realize about loons is they are extraordinary migrants. And so since the 1990s, people who live around lakes have really come together to protect breeding habitat. There's Loon Watch, run out of Northland College, which has spread throughout up north to try and stop that nest disturbance and all the boats from, destroying loon nests with their wake. And it's done an extraordinary effort at reframing cottage culture, reframing the people who live along the lakes and say, okay, let's protect loon habitat. And so loon nest sites are much less disturbed. So we've done a great job at taking local action. But loons are long-distance migrants. A loon that breeds here near Duluth in a Minnesota lake can spend 4 to 5 years flying into the Gulf. So they go back and forth before they're old enough to breed. They fly up to the North Atlantic, down to the Gulf Coast, all up and down through the Atlantic Ocean, where they run into all sorts of threats. That as important as local protection of nests, we also need to think globally. One of the major threats to loon persistence is actually lead, which in some ways is very easy to address. There are lots of good alternatives to lead fishing tackle and lead being used in wildlife refuges. But still, one recent New Hampshire study showed that 40% of loon mortality was actually lead poisoning. It's true for eagles as well. They're very, very susceptible. And toxics from the fossil fuel industry really threaten the persistence of water birds throughout North America. Loons are directly oiled by BP, for example, and a lot of the restoration efforts that are going on here in Minnesota are from BP money in trying to address the problems that they created through that spoil and their negligence. And so there's some wonderful restoration programs going on in Minnesota, but it doesn't yet address the larger issue of fossil fuel consumption. And just ordinary fossil fuel production, these aren't loons, they're mures, but ordinary fossil fuel production leads to very tiny bits of oil releases that accumulate and cause enormous problems for migratory shorebirds as they migrate from winter to breeding grounds. But our major threat in the north, of course, is mercury, because mercury bioaccumulates. We actually have what seem like really low levels in our northern lakes, but it methylates, and that means that CH3 groups get attached to the mercury, and elemental mercury isn't that dangerous for people or for vertebrates in general. You don't want to take huge amounts, but small amounts aren't going to kill you. But as it methylates, it begins to bioaccumulate. And so you can have 1 part per trillion in the water, and by the time it gets into the loons and other creatures that eat fish, namely people, you can have 10,000 times that, 100,000 times that. And it doesn't directly kill the adult loons, but what it does is change the way they offer parental care. So some of you have probably seen these baby loons sitting on the back of adult loons, both male and female. I can't see if you're seeing, but hopefully some of you have seen that. They're really adorable. And loons will do that. Baby loons stay very close to their parents for quite a while. And the adult loons offer them warming and offer them protection from predators. And parental care just really falls apart. It dramatically changes when the adults are contaminated with mercury. They stop allowing the chicks to ride on their back. They stop feeding them. So nest success is much less. And then you also see them tangled. So what's happening with loon restoration now is something similar to what's happening with caribou restoration and with sturgeon restoration. We still have hundreds of thousands of pairs of loons. We still have time to restore them. But what we need to do is to listen to the voices of all of our kin, of all of our cultures around us that make up this home. Because we tend to still sometimes think wildlife is out there and we can do what we want and maybe just protect a few wildlife refuges and they'll be fine. But I think the story of the loon, the gift of that loon, that story that child, that boy was told, still holds today. It's our responsibility to protect the world and all that we see, to keep the lake well stocked with fish. And I love that story because it's not about some hands-off, put up a wall and just leave nature alone. It's about really finding a way to partner with the rest of nature, to realize that our futures are entangled, that plastic that could kill a loon could also really harm us, that it's up to us to partner with all the other creatures that make up our watershed and figure out a way to move towards a future of clean water and healthy ecosystems. Not just for the loons and the caribou and the sturgeon, but for all of us and all of our relatives. So thank you very much. I am very hopeful that we can do this together, and I look forward to your questions and comments, and hopefully I wasn't too depressing. So thank you. So Tim, I don't know if you want to gather questions, because I realize I can't see if there are any questions on Zoom. Questions.
So we have microphones down in the front, so we'll take questions. So people should feel free to come on down and ask questions. We have plenty of time. While people are funneling down, I just have a basic question to start. How did you decide to write about these three species in particular? Was it the migration factor?
Yeah, great question. I trained as an ecologist before I became an environmental historian, and I worked on migratory species. I worked in Zimbabwe and carmine bee-eaters until Mugabe shut the country down. And there I got very interested in how humans were trying fortress conservation, just building walls and shooting people who came in the wrong side, and how it wasn't working. And then I worked in albatrosses, which are other really long-distance migrants that are very much affected by plastics. So I was partly, I've always loved loons and wolves and caribou, and I didn't realize that we still had sturgeon, and sturgeon are doing really well. We still have caribou that could do really well if we let them, if we help protect them. And I was curious, all three species, we've spent a century trying to conserve them, and yet their populations are still at risk. So I think for all three, it's time to bring in new perspectives, or really old perspectives. And all three, I think the stories are very hopeful at partnerships between tribal nations, indigenous communities, First Nations in Canada, and scientists to come together with communities to try and bring in these different perspectives. So. Thanks, Tim. And if people want to share stories about these animals too, it doesn't have to be a question. I'd love to hear your loon stories or your caribou stories or sturgeon. So if anyone has a question or a comment they'd like to share.
Hey.
Hi.
So it seems like we almost need a shift in consciousness in this culture.
Mm-hmm.
how do other cultures like Iceland, places you've traveled compare to America as far as their awareness of our unity with the natural world?
Yeah,
And
that's
also, what are some things we can do to help raise that consciousness here?
Yeah, great question. Iceland is interesting because there were no indigenous peoples or indigenous mammals except for Arctic fox and polar bears in Iceland when Danes first came, or when the Norse, as we know them, the Vikings. And so it has a very different settler colonial history, and people have spent, since 835, since settlement, trying to figure out how to survive on this small, cold, wind-whipped island. And at times, the human population almost crashed. It was a rough place to make a living, and all of a sudden it's super popular. So I think anywhere people go, I think we've all been migrants. I don't think there's some huge gap between indigenous ways of knowing and settler colonial ways of knowing. I think ultimately we're all on the move. We're all migrants, and we all learn how to become native to this place. As Wes Jackson said years ago, that we learn by making mistakes. When the ancestors of the Anishinaabe first followed the caribou over Lake Huron, I'm sure they made plenty of mistakes too. This was really different than where they'd come from. They had to figure it out. And I think part of the process of learning to become native to a place is learning to pay attention, learning that it's okay to make mistakes, and there are things you can learn. And so I think in Western European culture, settler culture, my Irish ancestors' culture, at first wilderness was this evil thing you had to massacre. My ancestors under Queen Elizabeth, destroyed every tree in the Scottish Highlands in an effort to get rid of wolves. And then when that was done, they went over to Ireland and did the same thing. They're not at all blameless people, my ancestors, and eventually they made their way here after many famines and have slowly been figuring out how to live more sustainably. And so I think one of the big messages is seeing the rest of nature as either wilderness, which is evil, or wilderness, which is perfect if we don't touch it. Isn't that useful? And I think many of the tribes and First Nations communities I've been fortunate enough to work with over the decades, I've been in the Midwest and also in the Pacific Northwest, that's just a very foreign way of thinking. I mean, nature is all of us. It's all around us. Anishinaabe peoples that I work with just think it's very bizarre. We would say, just let the caribou go extinct because we have to let the balance of nature. It's like, no, we help create the problem. If we have a helicopter, let's move them and figure out how to restore their habitat so we don't have to move them constantly. But I think one of the key things we need to learn is what reindeer peoples and caribou peoples have been figuring out for the 7,000 years. They've been partners with reindeer, which is how to allow the reindeer and caribou their own individual agency. So say in the Duka people I've done some work with, there's always one really experienced reindeer, just as the same with sturgeon, lake sturgeon, there's one really experienced sturgeon, and it's typically a female, you have to be very careful to protect her, because she's the one who knows the migration patterns. And you don't tell her where to migrate, you let her, because she knows more than you do, but you follow her and protect her and her family from wolves, which we've inadvertently increase wolf populations in some places. And that's fine. Wolves and caribou have coexisted for millennia, but that was when caribou had a chance to escape from them. And if we've changed the habitat so much, then it's our responsibility, according to, say, the Michipicoten First Nation, to offer what we can to caribou people to help them restore. So the tribes that I work with are really interested in learning from Sami peoples, and of course there's lots of Sami here, the Finnish Sami who came here to work in the mines, from learning what Sami people have known for thousands of years about what they call semi-domesticated relationships with animals. So rather than seeing animals as either wild, which you let roam in the wilderness, or else tame, which you tell them exactly what to do. Ask my dog how well that works. He's on the bed every night. So instead, you have to figure out a way to respect them as individuals, as populations with their own ideas, but also offer them protection. And what that looks like really varies from place to place. So that's partly the lesson of the sturgeon, is to respect them as individuals, protect the eldest, because they are the ones with 300 years of memory of history. But that also means you can harvest them. You can use them as a resource to survive, but it means still respecting their individual agency. And when I first started talking about this, I was out in Oregon, and a philosopher got up and said, that would take a complete rethinking of Western philosophy. Animals are different than humans. You can't possibly be suggesting that. And I was thinking, actually, so many peoples on earth have had a very different view. We don't have to reinvent a new philosophy. We just have to start listening to all the other peoples that we share this earth with who have figured this out. And so they have the stories, the philosophies that are not fundamentally different than ours, but we just have to learn to listen and partner with them as biologists, as restorationists. So you have a follow-up? Oh, okay, great, thanks, yeah. Other questions, other comments, other stories about loons, about wolves? Yeah, some people sometimes say, oh, you're against wolves. I love wolves. I spent much of my career really enthusiastic about the restoration efforts. But when we inadvertently create a situation where we've created great habitat for wolves and very few refugia for the animals they predate on, we need to rethink our relationships with that. And I'm certainly not saying kill off wolves, but I'm saying if we're going to have very high wolf populations, we also need to figure out ways of protecting their ancestral prey. Yeah. Other comments or questions? Any Zoom questions or comments? Oh, thank you. Thanks for saying that. I hope you read Climate Ghost too. I'm sure it's at the library. There are also copies out back that people can read. Climate Ghost is a shorter book, but Sustaining Lake Superior, I think they have at Fitger's and certainly in the library as well. Yeah, I've been so fortunate to be able to work and live on Lake Superior. I had been at Madison for years, as I mentioned, and the opportunity to move up to Lake Superior. I've partnered with IJC groups with the Binational Program, Binational Forum, for decades, and I was always the out-of-basin member. They could have one person from out of the Lake Superior Basin, and I got so tired of being the out-of-basin member that I was so thrilled when a chance came to move to Lake Superior Basin and be part of this incredible community, because it really is the greatest lake on earth, I think. I haven't been to Lake Baikal yet. Yeah, is that a question or comment? Or you just, no. Okay, sorry, I thought you were raising your hand. But no, you're scratching your head, sorry. So unless anyone wants to have the last word, we'll let you have the last word. Thank you for saying that. Oh, one more comment. Sorry, I have a hard time to see with the bright light, so that's fine, come back down.
With our current state of collective awareness in America, in the political scene, does it seem like we have way more of an uphill battle to do this than other cultures that you've been a part of and been able to be in tune with?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you keep from despair? How do I keep from despair? Does it seem like we have an uphill battle? Yeah, but I love uphill skiing. It gets you in shape. But, it's people, I spent a lot of time working on Lake Superior, sustaining Lake Superior. A lot of it is about the reserve mine and the chaos in Duluth when they realized that there were 1 billion fibers of asbestos per liter of drinking water in your drinking water in Duluth in the 1970s because of the dumping of asbestos-formed fibers from the reserve mine. And to so many of the people that started to try and fight that, Arlene Leto, a Finnish-American woman from this little village, Myrna Vise from Houghton, a suburban housewife, people laughed at them and said, you can never change that. It's one of the biggest corporations in the world. Don't even bother trying. But they partnered with scientists, with Finnish communities, with resource-dependent communities, with miners, with tribal communities, and they just kept showing up. They pestered the new EPA. They just showed up at the International Joint Commission meetings and said something's going wrong. And they managed to pull together a coalition to stop the dumping of that asbestos-formed fiber into Lake Superior. I mean, people think Lake Superior is pristine and untouched, but the story of Lake Superior is it was on the verge of real collapse, and communities came together to restore it and protect it. And so I think if these communities can manage to come together in difficult times and really restore so much of what we love about the lake, that it's not up to me to give up hope. I need to just keep trying. So I mentioned I was just at this EPA meeting, and there were hundreds of scientists there working on all sorts of aspects of Lake Superior, from the algal blooms to PFAS to PFOS to mercury, and the way climate change was changing currents. And you could get depressed listening to it, but it was also really inspiring seeing all these people from Lifwick, lots of scientists from Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Community, lots of people trying to figure out how do we protect and sustain and restore these communities in a changing world. So that has to give me hope that the things that bring about change are communities telling their leaders that they really have to listen and do something. And at times it can seem hopeless, but it does work. Politicians really do listen to their constituents if you just keep showing up. So my students are always like, oh, the government's horrible. But we are the government. I mean, the government is us. It's us showing up with one more person at a board meeting. It's us showing up to restore the creek. And eventually it's us showing up and running for Congress. And if we don't like something, getting out there and changing it to clean up the creek that runs into Lake Superior, or to clean up our house in Washington or down in the cities. So get involved is all I can say, because that's what will save our future in the Great Lakes. Thank you.
Time for another question, if anybody has one. Since we have time and nobody has a question, I will ask you a huge question, and feel free to take as much time as you want with it. How do you feel about the rights of nature debate as part of this discussion?
Yeah, how do I feel about the rights of nature debate? How do you feel about the rights of nature debate? Professor Lork, I'm going to turn that on you. It's an interesting question. I mean, philosophically, of course, nature has rights, but rights are something that are conceived of in human eyes, in human philosophical terms. I'm not sure scientifically it's the best framework to go ahead with understanding how and why things are changing and can be restored. But in terms of court cases, it can be powerful, to give the rights of nature, to say a river can, I hope, be a powerful tool. I'm not sure why. It's not something I think about as much as you do. So tell me more about why. Do you think it's a provocative or useful tool?
Well, I think that, like you mentioned with the courts, regardless of the philosophical aspect, there's a legal sort of potentially legal practicality, right? So that's what I'm curious about.
Can everyone hear him? Yeah.
That's why I'm asking you, these particular species.
Yeah, I think the court cases that have been most successful are looking at the rights of children, of youth, to have a livable climate, a stable climate. I mean, we're seeing the climate cases with Juliana and all sort of work their way through the courts. And there have been some real victories that, youth and children go and say, hey, you all don't have any rights to deprive me of a livable future. And I think those have been more powerful just because courts are where people argue for each other. Some country, I am not as familiar with the rights of nature articulation. I see it happening. I see it being used to articulate rights for a particular river in Colombia, I think it is. How much is actually changing behaviors or industrial dumping or pollution versus other more traditional contests, I'm not as clear about prey as you are. So do you think it's a valuable tool? Yeah. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I think one of the most important things we have for our future is a healthy population of hunters and anglers, because I think sort of animal rights that says you can't hurt individual animals is an interesting philosophical framework, but it sort of denies that we are animals. We are part of ecosystems. Predator and prey relationships have structured the world. And so I think hunting and fishing have been really essential at building constituencies for protected areas for natures. That's where licensing fees is where our DNRs get money to restore creeks and pull culverts. And when we lose an entire generation of people who want to go fishing and hunting, I think we stand at grave risk of losing a generation of people who feel really connected because they've literally sat in a stand or stood in a river for hours and hours, and you just get to know the world around you in a way by hunting or fishing. My husband's an organic farmer, farming. And I think some of the animal rights are in, nature has full rights, sort of think all those things are really bad. But I think they've been part of human experience for as long as we've been human. And they can be done poorly, but I think in essence, they're really important ways we know the world around us. So if rights of nature also recognize humans as part of nature, I'm all for it. But if it puts up a bigger wall between everything humans do, then I'm troubled. I think we will need to do more mining in the Great Lakes Basin for energy storage for the transition to renewables. But I think we can do it really intelligently. I think we can start by mining old batteries. I think we can start by using old abandoned mines as water batteries. And eventually we probably will need new mines, but they need to be developed in a way that doesn't destroy water quality. But we can do that. We know how to do it. We just have to be willing to pay the money to do it. So I'm not a rights of nature advocate if it means leaving nature untouched. I think that can lead into this, just have the balance of nature take over. And I think that ship has sailed a long time ago, that we have a responsibility to coexist with the rest of nature in a way that can be really manipulative. We're going to have to, if we want many of these species to persist, we're going to have to help them migrate in a warming world, and figuring out how to do that respectfully is a difficult task, but it can be done because we've been doing it for hundreds of years. We just have to learn from our elders how to do it respectfully.
I think that's a great place to end it.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Nancy Langston.